My name is Lorelai. I am exactly 32 years old and I manage a small rural inn to support my brilliant 16-year-old daughter. Exactly 16 years ago, I made a massive decision that completely destroyed my relationship with my highly wealthy family. I walked out of a massive stone mansion wearing a thin jacket and carrying a tiny newborn baby in my tired arms. I chose absolute poverty and constant daily struggle over a suffocating golden cage. What followed is a complex story of generational trauma and the heavy price of financial freedom. Welcome to Drama Storytime, where we sit quietly with the dark secrets families never talk about out loud. Please leave a comment and be sure to subscribe to the channel. My parents are incredibly rich and highly manipulative. They treated my entire childhood like a cold corporate business merger. Every single decision was carefully calculated to maintain their elite social status in our wealthy city. When I got pregnant in high school, they immediately drafted a formal legal contract for my entire future. They demanded that I marry a wealthy boy I absolutely did not love. They wanted me to live in a house they completely controlled, and they planned to manage my young child like a brand new financial asset. I absolutely refused to sign my basic freedom away to their endless demands. I packed a small canvas bag in the middle of the dark night and ran away to a tiny rural town. I started my brand new independent life working as a simple maid at a local inn. I lived in a tiny wooden shed behind the main building with my sweet infant daughter. The physical labor was incredibly exhausting, and we ate cheap canned food for many long years. But every single dollar I earned belonged entirely to me. I slowly worked my way up the corporate ladder over 16 years of brutal dedication. I am currently the executive manager of that exact same rural inn. My beautiful daughter grew up surrounded by warm local townspeople instead of cold corporate executives. She is incredibly smart and spends her entire weekend reading thick classic novels. She dreams of attending a prestigious university and becoming a famous international journalist. The peaceful life we slowly built from the ground up is currently facing a massive dark storm. My brilliant daughter recently received an official acceptance letter from a highly exclusive preparatory academy. This elite private school is her only clear path to securing a specific spot at a top-tier college. We happily celebrated the amazing news for exactly 1 hour before the heavy financial reality completely crushed my tired spirit. The annual tuition for the private academy is exactly $50,000. My modest manager salary barely covers our daily groceries and winter heating bills. I do not have a single dime saved for such a massive educational expense. I tried applying for several bank loans, but the strict bank managers immediately rejected my desperate applications. I realized with deep horror that I had to do the exact thing I promised myself I would absolutely never do again. I had to ask my wealthy parents for a massive financial loan. The mere thought of sitting in their quiet living room made my stomach completely twist into tight knots. My parents absolutely never give away their money without attaching heavy iron chains. They use their massive wealth to passively, aggressively manipulate and deeply control every single person around them. I knew asking them for $50,000 would give them the ultimate leverage they had desired for 16 long years. They would definitely use this specific debt to force their way back into my peaceful life. I put on a conservative dark dress and drove my rusted car toward their massive estate on a Friday evening. The drive took exactly 30 minutes, but it felt like a terrible march toward a cold execution. I parked my old vehicle in front of their tall iron security gates and took a very deep breath. I looked at my shaking hands resting on the steering wheel. My 16-year-old daughter had absolutely no idea I was actively sacrificing my hard-earned mental freedom to pay for her elite education. I pressed the small brass intercom button and waited for the heavy metal gates to slowly open. I drove up the long paved driveway and stared at the massive stone house. I was finally stepping directly back into the cold golden cage, and I knew the emotional price would be incredibly severe. I walked up the wide stone steps and stood in front of the massive wooden door. The grand entrance looked exactly the same as the night I ran away 16 years ago. A quiet maid wearing a crisp black uniform opened the heavy door and guided me into the grand foyer. The air inside the mansion was perfectly climate controlled and smelled faintly of expensive floor wax. My mother slowly descended the grand curved staircase. She wore an immaculate, tailored suit that probably cost more than my entire rusted car. She did not offer a warm hug or a simple smile. She stopped exactly 2 feet away from me and immediately began inspecting my physical appearance. She stated that my dark dress was completely inappropriate for a Friday evening. I took a very slow breath and forced my tense facial muscles to remain completely neutral. The quiet maid led us into the formal study where my father was sitting in a leather chair. He was deeply focused on reading a thick financial newspaper. He barely acknowledged my presence when I sat down on the uncomfortable antique sofa. He simply asked the maid to bring a tray of warm tea. The suffocating silence stretched across the massive room for several long minutes. My mother finally broke the quiet tension by asking why I was visiting them after exactly 3 years of absolute silence. She used her soft voice to passively, aggressively suggest that I only remembered their existence when my life was falling apart. I gripped the fabric of my dress and prepared to hand them the exact weapon they needed to control my peaceful life. I kept my voice perfectly flat and told them about their brilliant 16-year-old granddaughter. I explained that the smart girl had just received a formal acceptance letter from the most exclusive preparatory academy in the state. I watched my mother raise a perfectly shaped eyebrow in slight surprise. I swallowed my heavy pride and stated that the annual tuition was exactly $50,000. I told them I was requesting a formal financial loan to cover the massive educational expense. I promised to repay every single penny with a strict interest rate. My father finally lowered his heavy newspaper and looked directly into my eyes. His gaze was incredibly cold and purely calculating. My mother smiled a very tiny and deeply terrifying smile. They instantly realized I was completely trapped. The wealthy man cleared his throat and began speaking like a ruthless corporate negotiator. He stated that giving a massive, unsecured loan to a runaway daughter was a terrible business decision. My mother quickly joined the aggressive attack. She claimed I had selfishly kept their only granddaughter hidden from their proper elite society. She told me they would agree to write the massive check, but the money came with a strict string attached. They demanded that I bring the young girl to their massive estate for a formal dinner every single Friday night. They wanted to actively shape her bright future and introduce her to their wealthy social circle. The heavy iron chains were finally placed directly onto the glass table. Attending a formal dinner every single Friday meant surrendering my hard-earned peace. It meant forcing my innocent daughter to endure their endless passive-aggressive comments. I had spent 16 long years building a warm sanctuary to protect her from their toxic manipulation. Now I was actively inviting the cold monsters right back into our tiny living room. I knew her dream of attending a top-tier university was completely dependent on this specific private academy. I looked at the two wealthy strangers sitting across from me and slowly nodded my head. I firmly stated that I agreed to their strict terms. The terrible deal was officially struck, and my golden cage was locked once again. I drove away from the massive stone mansion with a terrible feeling in my stomach. The heavy iron gates closed behind my rusted car. I drove back to our tiny rural town while the dark night sky swallowed the wealthy suburbs. The formal agreement was a massive victory for my parents, but a total, absolute defeat for my personal freedom. I had to figure out how to tell my brilliant daughter that her educational dream came with a massive social price. I parked my old vehicle outside our small wooden house and sat in the dark for 10 long minutes. I needed to compose my tired face so she would not see my deep internal anxiety. The tiny house felt incredibly safe compared to the cold mansion I had just successfully escaped. My 16-year-old daughter was sitting on the worn sofa when I finally walked through the front door. She was completely surrounded by thick textbooks and holding a bright yellow highlighter. She looked up and smiled a truly beautiful smile. I took off my dark dress coat and sat down right next to her on the comfortable cushions. I took a very deep breath and told her the incredible news first. I told her that the massive tuition for the exclusive preparatory academy was completely and fully funded. The young girl jumped up from the sofa and hugged me incredibly tight. She danced around the small living room with pure, absolute joy. Her bright happiness was the exact reason I made the terrible deal with the wealthy monsters. I watched her celebrate and knew I would endure 1,000 painful dinners just to see her succeed. I waited for her to slowly calm down before I delivered the heavy bad news. I asked her to sit back down on the worn sofa. I kept my voice very soft and explained exactly where the massive sum of $50,000 actually came from. The bright smile instantly vanished from her young, innocent face. She knew exactly how much I deeply despised asking my wealthy parents for absolutely anything. The smart teenager immediately understood that my parents never gave away their vast money without a strict, unyielding condition. She looked at me with wide eyes and asked what I had to sacrifice to secure the massive loan. I told her all about the mandatory Friday dinner agreement. I explained that we had to visit the massive stone estate every single week for a highly formal meal. The young girl slumped back into the soft cushions and let out a very long sigh. She had only met her wealthy grandparents a few times when she was a tiny toddler. She only knew them through my dark stories of extreme parental control and cold emotional manipulation. She felt incredibly guilty that I had to endure their toxic presence just to pay for her elite education. I reached out and gently held her warm hands. I firmly told her that she absolutely never needed to feel guilty for being incredibly smart and highly ambitious. I stated that her bright future was worth 100 terrible Friday dinners. We sat together in our small living room and mentally prepared our minds for the upcoming social war. We promised each other that we would absolutely never let the wealthy family tear our tight bond apart. The very first Friday dinner arrived much faster than I ever wanted. I forced my teenage daughter to wear a conservative dark skirt and a simple white blouse. I wore another modest dark dress to completely avoid giving my critical mother any easy visual targets. We drove the rusted car back to the wealthy suburbs in total, absolute silence. The heavy anxiety filled the small vehicle like thick gray smoke. We pulled up to the tall iron security gates, and the young girl gasped at the sheer size of the massive stone property. She had never truly understood the extreme level of vast wealth I had walked away from 16 long years ago. I parked the old vehicle and we walked up the wide stone steps together. I promised my sweet daughter that we would simply smile and eat the expensive food and leave as fast as humanly possible. I pressed the small brass doorbell and braced my tired mind for the inevitable passive-aggressive attacks. The heavy wooden door opened slowly to reveal the grand foyer. The quiet maid took our thin jackets and instructed us to wait in the formal living room. My mother walked into the large room wearing another completely flawless designer suit. She looked directly at my teenage daughter and offered a very small smile. She stated that the young girl had grown into a beautiful young woman despite her highly unconventional upbringing. The passive-aggressive insult landed perfectly in the quiet room. I took a deep breath and reminded myself about the massive $50,000 check. I told my mother that my daughter was incredibly smart and very excited about the exclusive private academy. My father entered the formal room holding a heavy crystal glass filled with expensive liquor. He nodded his head toward the young girl and formally welcomed her to the family estate. He completely ignored me and asked the maid to serve the evening dinner. We walked into the massive dining room and sat at a long mahogany table. The fine china plates and the heavy silver utensils looked entirely alien to my rural daughter. We were completely used to eating cheap takeout food on a worn sofa while watching old movies. The quiet maid poured expensive, sparkling water into our crystal glasses. The extreme wealth of the room felt like a heavy blanket pressing down on my tired shoulders. The first course of the formal meal was a complicated French soup. My mother watched my teenage daughter carefully to see if she knew which specific silver spoon to use. The smart girl flawlessly picked up the correct utensil and began eating quietly. My mother seemed slightly disappointed that she could not correct the basic table manners of her granddaughter. She decided to redirect her sharp focus back onto my absolute personal failures. She mentioned that the rural inn I currently managed was probably struggling in the current economic climate. She suggested that a real corporate job would provide much better financial stability for a single mother. I kept my voice completely flat and stated that the local inn was actually fully booked for the entire summer season. I told her I was highly proud of the successful rural business I helped build from the absolute ground up. My father wiped his mouth with a crisp linen napkin and quickly joined the verbal attack. He stated that managing a tiny rural hotel was completely insignificant compared to running a massive global corporation. He reminded the entire table that I was originally supposed to attend a prestigious business school before I made my terrible teenage mistakes. The heavy weight of his cruel words hung over the expensive food. My sweet daughter looked at me with deep concern in her bright eyes. She had never seen anyone speak to me with such absolute disrespect. I gave her a tiny reassuring smile to let her know I was perfectly fine. I told my father that my past choices gave me the absolute greatest gift of my entire life. I looked directly at the 16-year-old girl and told the wealthy man I would absolutely never change a single thing about my difficult past. The rest of the expensive meal passed in highly uncomfortable silence. We finished the tiny portions of rich food and immediately stood up from the heavy wooden chairs. I thanked the wealthy monsters for their generous hospitality and guided my daughter toward the grand foyer. The quiet maid handed us our thin jackets. My mother reminded us that she expected us to return at exactly 7 in the evening next Friday. We walked out the heavy front door and stepped directly into the cool night air. The massive stone mansion disappeared in our rearview mirror as I drove the rusted car away. My teenage daughter let out a massive sigh of total relief. We had successfully survived the very first battle in the Golden Cage. We drove back to our tiny rural town knowing we had to face the exact same social war every single week until her elite education was completely finished. The first day of classes at the exclusive preparatory academy arrived with a bright golden sunrise. I woke up at exactly 5 in the morning to prepare a warm breakfast for my brilliant teenage daughter. She walked into the tiny kitchen wearing her brand new school uniform. The strict dress code required a heavy plaid skirt and a crisp white blouse and a dark blue blazer. She looked incredibly mature and completely terrified at the exact same time. I poured her a large mug of black coffee and told her she looked absolutely perfect. We sat at the small wooden table in total silence while the heavy reality of the massive life change settled over our tired minds. The drive to the elite private school took exactly 45 minutes. We left our quiet rural town and slowly entered a highly wealthy district filled with massive stone buildings. The preparatory academy looked exactly like a royal European castle. Tall iron gates guarded the pristine green lawns and heavy oak doors marked the grand main entrance. Expensive luxury cars were lined up along the wide circular driveway. Wealthy parents, wearing tailored designer suits, were dropping off their equally wealthy children. My rusted old vehicle sputtered loudly as I parked near a massive stone fountain. My sweet daughter grabbed her heavy backpack and took a very deep breath. I walked her towards the heavy oak doors and watched the other wealthy students carefully. They were all carrying expensive leather bags and talking loudly about their luxurious summer vacations in foreign countries. My teenage girl felt incredibly small standing next to the children of powerful corporate executives and wealthy politicians. I stopped walking and gently placed my hands on her tense shoulders. I looked directly into her bright eyes and reminded her that she earned her spot at this elite school through pure, absolute brilliance. I told her that all the massive wealth in the entire world could never buy the incredible brain she possessed. She offered a brave, tiny smile and walked through the grand wooden doors to face her brand new reality. I drove my rusted vehicle back to the small rural town and headed straight to the local inn. My entire morning was completely consumed by complex hotel management duties. I organized the weekly cleaning schedules and reviewed the massive food orders for the main dining room. But my tired mind constantly drifted back to the Grand Stone Academy. I wondered if the wealthy students were being cruel to my sweet rural girl. I wondered if the incredibly strict teachers were giving her a fair chance to show her massive intelligence. The extreme anxiety of being a single mother pressed heavily against my chest all day long. The late afternoon sun was slowly setting when my daughter finally returned to our small wooden house. She dropped her heavy backpack onto the worn sofa and collapsed right next to it. I sat down on the soft cushions and gently asked her about the very first day. She looked completely exhausted, but there was a bright spark of pure determination in her tired eyes. She told me the academic classes were incredibly difficult, and the wealthy students were highly exclusive. The rich teenagers had formed tight social circles, and they completely ignored the brand new girl from the tiny rural town. But she proudly stated that she correctly answered a highly complex history question that completely stumped the entire class. We decided to celebrate her successful first day by ordering a massive amount of cheap takeout food. We spread the cardboard boxes across the small coffee table and ate delicious, warm noodles while sitting on the wooden floor. The simple meal was the exact opposite of the highly formal Friday dinners we were forced to endure at the massive stone estate. There were absolutely no crystal glasses or expensive linen napkins in our tiny living room. We simply laughed loudly and talked over each other while eating directly from the cardboard containers. This tiny house was our absolute safe sanctuary, and absolutely no amount of corporate wealth could ever replace the genuine love we shared. The massive financial sacrifice of the Friday dinners suddenly felt entirely justified. My brilliant girl was finally receiving the elite education she truly deserved. We spent the rest of the evening reading thick classic novels on the worn sofa. We drank warm tea and completely ignored the massive social divide waiting for her back at the Stone Academy. I knew the coming months would test her mental strength in absolutely brutal ways. But I also knew she was raised by a mother who successfully escaped a cold golden cage. She possessed the exact same fierce independence, and we were absolutely ready to fight for her bright future. The second week at the exclusive preparatory academy brought a massive wave of intense academic pressure. The brilliant teenage girl spent every single evening sitting on our worn sofa, surrounded by towering piles of heavy library books. Her highly demanding literature teacher assigned a massive group project that required extensive historical research. The cruel twist of fate was that the strict teacher randomly assigned the specific student groups. My sweet daughter was paired directly with the most ruthless and highly competitive wealthy girl in the entire school. This specific rich teenager viewed every single academic assignment as a brutal corporate war, and she absolutely hated the new rural student. The wealthy rival immediately demanded that they hold their initial study session at her massive luxury apartment in the city. My teenage girl rode the public bus for exactly 2 hours just to reach the expensive building. She later told me that the rich student spent the entire first hour making passive, aggressive comments about her simple clothing and her rural hometown. The cruel girl tried to completely dominate the academic project by assigning all the tedious research tasks to my daughter. She expected the rural student to quietly accept the menial labor without a single complaint. But the rural girl, raised by a fiercely independent mother, absolutely refused to be intimidated by a wealthy bully. She looked directly at the rich student and firmly stated that they would divide the heavy workload perfectly equally. She then flawlessly corrected a massive historical error the wealthy girl had written in her initial outline. The wealthy rival was completely shocked by the sudden display of pure academic dominance, and she silently agreed to the fair terms. While my brave daughter was fighting her own battles at the elite academy, I was facing a brand new psychological attack from my wealthy parents. A massive delivery truck suddenly parked in front of our tiny wooden house on a quiet Wednesday afternoon. 2 strong men carried a highly expensive antique wooden desk into our small living room. The delivery driver handed me a thick envelope containing a formal letter written on heavy stationery. My mother wrote that she simply could not allow her brilliant granddaughter to study on a cheap coffee table. She stated that the expensive antique desk was a necessary tool for proper academic success. The passive-aggressive gift was a brilliant tactical move in their endless psychological war. My parents knew I completely despised having their expensive items inside my safe rural sanctuary, but they also knew I could absolutely not return the massive desk without seeming incredibly petty and ungrateful to my own daughter. They were slowly infiltrating my peaceful life with their vast wealth, one expensive object at a time. I stood in the middle of the tiny living room and stared at the heavy wooden furniture. The antique desk looked entirely ridiculous sitting next to our worn sofa and cheap television set. It was a physical manifestation of the golden cage slowly creeping into my independent world. I desperately wanted to drag the heavy desk out into the front yard and set it entirely on fire, but I forced myself to swallow my rising anger for the sake of the massive tuition check. My sweet daughter returned home late that evening looking completely exhausted from her tense study session. She walked into the small living room and immediately noticed the massive antique desk. I took a deep breath and explained that her wealthy grandparents sent the expensive furniture to help with her heavy academic workload. The smart teenager looked at the ornate wooden details and sighed heavily. She knew exactly what the expensive gift truly represented. We silently agreed to push the heavy desk into a dark corner of the room. She placed her cheap plastic pencil cup on top of the polished wood and started working on her massive literature project. We were successfully learning how to survive the constant passive aggressive attacks while protecting our warm rural bond. The heavy pressure of the elite academy and the toxic Friday dinners was slowly becoming our brand new normal routine. We relied entirely on our deep mutual trust to navigate the complex social landmines. The upcoming Friday dinner was looming dark on the weekly calendar, and we both knew my mother would demand extreme gratitude for the expensive wooden desk. We spent the rest of Thursday evening rehearsing our polite responses to completely avoid another brutal verbal battle at the massive stone estate. We practiced keeping our faces entirely blank and our voices perfectly monotone. We treated the wealthy family dinners like a highly dangerous undercover mission. Surviving the massive stone mansion required extreme emotional discipline and an unbreakable sense of dark humor. The rusted car slowly approached the massive iron gates for our second mandatory Friday dinner. We sat in total silence while the heavy metal doors swung open to reveal the grand stone estate. I parked the old vehicle and we walked up the wide stone steps together. The quiet maid opened the heavy wooden door and directed us toward the formal living room. My mother was waiting for us wearing a stunning dark velvet dress. She looked directly at my teenage daughter. The psychological war officially resumed the exact second we stepped onto the expensive wool carpet. We sat carefully on the uncomfortable antique sofa. My mother immediately brought up the massive wooden desk she sent to our tiny rural house. She expected a grand display of total gratitude for her highly expensive gift. My sweet daughter politely smiled and thanked her wealthy grandmother for the generous furniture. The smart teenager stated that the heavy desk was incredibly useful for her massive literature project. My mother nodded her head in deep satisfaction. I kept my face completely blank and stared at the blank wall behind her head. I absolutely refused to give her the supreme satisfaction of seeing my deep internal anger. The quiet maid announced that the formal dinner was ready to be served. We relocated to the massive dining room and sat at the long mahogany table. My father sat at the very head of the table and completely ignored us while eating his expensive steak. My mother decided to launch her brand new psychological attack right after the second course. She casually mentioned an upcoming charity ball at their highly exclusive country club. She stated that all the wealthy families from the elite preparatory academy would be in full attendance. She looked directly at my teenage daughter and announced she had purchased a highly expensive ball gown for the young girl. The sudden announcement landed on the dining table like a heavy lead brick. My mother was actively trying to force my rural daughter into her toxic elite society. She wanted to parade the brilliant teenager around the wealthy country club like a brand new expensive trophy. I could feel the hot blood rushing to my tired face. I took a slow breath and told my mother that my daughter was incredibly busy with her heavy academic workload. I stated that she absolutely did not have enough free time to attend a meaningless, wealthy social event. My mother slowly placed her silver fork onto the fine china plate and delivered a truly devastating passive-aggressive blow. The wealthy woman softly reminded me about the massive $50,000 tuition check. She stated that securing a spot at a top-tier university required much more than just good academic grades. She claimed the teenage girl absolutely needed to build strong social connections with powerful, elite families. She framed the terrible country club ball as a mandatory educational requirement instead of a toxic social trap. The heavy iron chains of the golden cage pulled incredibly tight around my neck. I looked at my sweet daughter sitting quietly across the massive table. The young girl gave me a tiny nod of total surrender. We were completely trapped by the massive financial debt. I looked back at my wealthy mother and quietly agreed to the formal ball. The rest of the miserable dinner passed in total suffocating silence. We finished our tiny desserts and immediately rushed toward the grand foyer. The quiet maid handed us our thin winter jackets. My mother smiled a victorious smile and told the young girl the expensive dress would arrive on Wednesday morning. We walked out into the cold night air and practically ran toward the rusted car. We drove back to our tiny rural town feeling entirely defeated by the ruthless, wealthy monsters. The elite academic dream was slowly turning into a massive social nightmare, but we absolutely refused to stop fighting for her bright future. The massive delivery box arrived at our tiny rural house exactly on Wednesday morning. The heavy cardboard was sealed with expensive gold tape. I carried the massive package into our small living room and placed it carefully on the worn sofa. My sweet teenage daughter returned from her elite school looking entirely exhausted from her heavy academic workload. She saw the massive box and let out a very long sigh of total dread. We slowly opened the expensive packaging together. Inside the crisp tissue paper rested a highly elaborate blue silk ball gown. The expensive dress was completely stunning and probably cost more than my entire rusted car. The brilliant teenage girl held the heavy silk fabric against her tired body. She looked entirely out of place, standing in our tiny kitchen, wearing such a massive symbol of extreme wealth. But she was incredibly brave and completely determined to survive the toxic social event for the sake of her elite education. We spent the entire Saturday afternoon preparing for the terrible country club ball. I helped her style her beautiful dark hair and pinned it up with simple silver clips. She put on the heavy blue silk dress and transformed into a perfect image of high society elegance. I wore my very best dark, modest dress and hoped I would simply blend into the dark shadows of the grand ballroom. We drove the rusted vehicle toward the highly exclusive country club as the evening sun slowly disappeared. The long paved driveway was completely filled with massive luxury vehicles and private chauffeurs. I handed my cheap car keys to a highly confused valet attendant, and we walked up the wide marble steps. The grand entrance of the country club was completely overwhelming. Massive crystal chandeliers hung from the tall painted ceilings. A live classical orchestra played soft music in the bright corner of the massive ballroom. My mother was waiting for us near the grand entrance wearing another flawless designer gown. She looked at my beautiful daughter and smiled a highly victorious smile. The wealthy grandmother immediately grabbed the arm of the young girl and pulled her into the massive crowd of elite socialites. I followed closely behind them, feeling entirely invisible and completely out of place. My mother introduced the brilliant teenager to incredibly powerful corporate executives and wealthy local politicians. She presented my sweet daughter like a brand new, expensive trophy she had just purchased at a high-end auction. The wealthy people looked at the young girl with deep, calculating eyes. They asked her highly complex questions about her heavy academic workload and her future university plans. They expected the girl from the rural town to completely stumble over her words and embarrass herself in front of the elite crowd. I stood quietly in the background and watched my brave daughter handle the massive social pressure with absolute, flawless grace. She answered every single question with pure intelligence and perfect, polite manners. The wealthy adults were completely shocked by her massive vocabulary and her deep understanding of complex historical literature. She confidently discussed classical philosophy with a highly intimidating federal judge, and then flawlessly transitioned to talking about modern international politics with a rich corporate banker. The rich rival from her elite school was standing across the massive ballroom wearing a highly expensive red dress. The cruel, wealthy girl watched in total absolute jealousy as my rural daughter effortlessly charmed the most powerful people in the entire room. My father finally walked over to our small group, holding his usual glass of expensive liquor. He looked at the teenage girl holding her own in the elite crowd and gave a very small nod of rare approval. The heavy iron chains of the golden cage were actively trying to pull my sweet daughter entirely away from our warm rural life. My mother was actively trying to mold the young girl into a perfect replica of her own cold, wealthy image. But watching her stand tall under the massive crystal chandeliers, I realized something incredibly profound. She was absolutely not being absorbed by the toxic elite society. She was simply learning how to completely navigate their cold world without ever losing her own warm heart. We survived the terrible charity ball and drove back to our tiny wooden house feeling a brand new sense of quiet strength. We were slowly mastering the complex rules of the wealthy monsters. The weeks following the formal charity ball brought a brand new level of complex psychological warfare. My wealthy mother realized that my brilliant teenage daughter was a highly valuable social asset for her elite circle. She stopped directing her passive-aggressive attacks solely at my tired face across the mahogany table. The wealthy grandmother began calling the young girl directly on her cellular telephone every single afternoon. She completely bypassed my parental authority to offer expensive rewards for high academic grades. The massive stone estate was slowly extending its cold shadow directly over my warm rural sanctuary. The intense academic pressure at the exclusive preparatory academy was already pushing my sweet daughter to her absolute physical limits. She studied until 2 in the morning every single night just to maintain her perfect grades in the difficult classes. The cruel, wealthy rival from her literature class constantly tried to sabotage her massive group projects and steal her hard-earned academic credit. My exhausted teenager rode the loud public bus for nearly 2 hours every single day just to reach the elite Stone campus. The long daily commute drained her bright energy and left her looking completely pale and entirely defeated by Friday evening. I watched her struggle from the worn sofa and felt entirely helpless against the massive weight of her expensive, elite education. The dark tension finally exploded exactly 2 days before her 17th birthday. We arrived at the massive stone mansion for our mandatory Friday dinner feeling completely drained. The quiet maid opened the heavy wooden doors and led us directly outside to the pristine circular driveway. My wealthy parents were standing proudly next to a brand new silver luxury car. The expensive vehicle was wrapped in a massive red silk bow that gleamed under the exterior security lights. My mother smiled her terrifying smile and announced that the expensive car was a generous birthday present for her brilliant granddaughter. She stated that the young girl absolutely deserved a safe and reliable vehicle to survive her long school commute. The massive silver car was the ultimate toxic trap designed by absolute masters of manipulation. It was a beautiful metal cage designed to completely buy the unconditional loyalty of my exhausted teenager. I immediately stepped forward and firmly stated that we could absolutely not accept such an extravagant and highly manipulative gift. I told my wealthy parents that keeping a luxury vehicle parked outside our tiny rural house was completely impractical and entirely inappropriate. I expected my brave daughter to stand firmly right next to me and reject the toxic money just like we always did in the past. But the heavy exhaustion of the brutal public bus commute had slowly worn down her strong rural armor. The smart teenager looked at the beautiful silver car and then looked directly at my tired face with highly conflicted eyes. She softly stated that having a reliable vehicle would give her 2 extra hours of vital sleep every single night. She completely defended the wealthy monsters and their highly manipulative gift right in front of them. The sudden, unexpected betrayal felt like a massive physical blow delivered directly to my chest. The golden cage had finally found the exact right pressure point to break our solid, united front. My wealthy mother watched the deep, painful crack form between us, and she looked entirely victorious. The long drive back to our tiny wooden house was filled with the most suffocating silence of my entire life. We walked into the small living room, and the massive, emotional argument immediately began. I told the young girl that accepting the expensive silver car meant handing her entire soul over to the wealthy manipulators who wanted to control her destiny. She angrily replied that I was letting my own dark past ruin her bright, modern future. The exhausted teenager yelled that she was completely sick of suffering on cold public buses just to protect my fragile, independent ego. She ran into her small bedroom and slammed the thin wooden door entirely shut. I sat alone on the worn sofa and realized the wealthy monsters were finally winning the long, brutal war to steal my only child. The morning sun rose over our tiny rural town, bringing absolutely no warmth to the cold wooden house. I woke up after entirely 0 hours of sleep. My mind endlessly replayed the terrible argument from the previous night. I walked into the small kitchen and brewed a fresh pot of dark coffee. My sweet teenage daughter emerged from her small bedroom looking completely miserable and highly exhausted. We sat at the small wooden table in total absolute silence. The heavy weight of our emotional fight pressed down on my tired shoulders like a massive block of concrete. I watched her pack her heavy school backpack and head out the front door to catch the early public bus. I realized my deep fear of the golden cage had completely blinded me to her actual physical suffering. I was actively projecting my own dark past onto her bright modern future, and it was slowly breaking her strong spirit. I spent the entire day working at the rural inn with a very heavy heart. My tired mind kept returning to the massive silver car sitting in that grand circular driveway. I wondered if I should just swallow my massive pride and let her keep the expensive vehicle. Late in the afternoon, my cellular telephone suddenly rang loudly in my small office. It was my brilliant teenage daughter calling from the elite Stone campus. She sounded completely out of breath and deeply upset. She told me her wealthy grandmother had just called her during her brief lunch break. The wealthy woman explicitly demanded that the young girl use the brand new silver car to drive the cruel, wealthy rival home from school every single day. The wealthy grandmother was actively using the expensive gift to force a fake friendship and secure a much higher social standing in the elite community. The smart teenager finally saw the heavy iron chains hidden completely beneath the shiny silver paint. She realized the expensive vehicle was absolutely not a generous birthday present. It was a strict social contract designed to control her daily actions. She told me she firmly rejected the wealthy demand and immediately hung up the telephone. She arrived back at our tiny wooden house just as the evening sun started to set. We stood in the small living room and hugged each other incredibly tight. She apologized for letting the extreme physical exhaustion cloud her normally sharp judgment. I completely apologized for letting my stubborn, independent pride make her daily life so incredibly difficult. We sat on the worn sofa and promised we would absolutely never let the wealthy monsters divide our small family ever again. The shiny silver car was nothing but a beautiful toxic trap, and we were entirely done playing their cruel psychological games. We spent the next 2 hours formulating a completely independent plan to solve her commute problem. I counted my hard-earned savings from managing the busy rural inn. I realized I had exactly enough cash to buy a very old but highly reliable used vehicle from a local mechanic in our small town. It would absolutely not be a shiny luxury car with leather seats, but it would belong entirely to us. The brilliant young girl smiled a massive, bright smile and completely agreed to the simple plan. She proudly stated that a rusted old car meant pure absolute freedom, while the silver luxury vehicle meant total suffocating slavery. We finally repaired the deep, painful crack in our warm rural bond and prepared our minds to face the wealthy monsters one final time. We went to the local mechanic that exact same evening and purchased a small green car with manual windows. We drove our brand new, old vehicle back to the massive stone estate on the following Friday evening. We walked into the grand dining room and sat at the long mahogany table. My mother looked highly expectant and patiently waited for our total, absolute surrender. I looked directly into her cold, calculating eyes and kept my voice perfectly steady. I firmly stated that we absolutely rejected the silver luxury car. I told her we purchased our very own vehicle using entirely our own hard-earned money. The wealthy woman looked completely shocked and deeply furious. She finally realized her ultimate manipulation tactic had completely failed to break our strong bond. My sweet daughter sat incredibly tall in her heavy wooden chair and supported my final decision with absolute perfect grace. She looked at her wealthy grandmother and stated she preferred to drive a cheap car she actually owned. We finished our highly tense, expensive meal and walked out of the massive stone mansion together. The heavy iron gates closed behind us for the evening, but we were absolutely no longer afraid of the golden cage. We knew the elite education required us to attend the mandatory dinners, but we held the absolute power to reject their toxic gifts. We drove the small green car back to our tiny wooden house, feeling entirely victorious and completely free. Our small rural life was built on pure, genuine love and deep mutual respect. Absolutely no amount of corporate wealth could ever buy the beautiful freedom we fiercely protected. Thank you for listening to Drama Storytime. Stay incredibly strong and always protect your own warm sanctuary. I will see you in the very next story.